Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable lives and incredible resilience of medieval peasants, the everyday heroes who, despite the odds, managed to survive some of the coldest and most brutal nights in history. From makeshift insulation tricks to communal sleeping strategies, their story is one of grit, ingenuity, and determination. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you think of medieval life, you might imagine jousting knights, grand feasts, and merry fairs. But for the average peasant, winter was less about merriment and more about, how do we not die tonight? It wasn't just a season. It was a test of endurance that came around every year, like an especially cruel teacher who didn't believe in second chances. Picture this. You're living in a tiny mud and stick hut, with walls so thin you could probably hear a bird sneeze from outside. No insulation. No windows, unless you count a small hole stuffed with animal skin. And definitely no thermostat wars with your siblings. The inside temperature of your home was usually just a polite couple of degrees above whatever the weather was doing outside. If it was freezing outdoors, it was politely slightly less freezing inside. Congratulations. Nights were the worst. Darkness swallowed everything. The wind howled like an angry ghost, and the fire in the hearth sputtered pathetically, doing its best but mostly just roasting the toes of whoever was sitting closest. If you were on the other side of the room, sorry, you might as well have been camping outside, with worse snacks. Clothing wasn't much help either. Peasants didn't own fancy fur coats or goose-down blankets. You had a couple of rough-spun wool tunics, maybe a cloak that smelled suspiciously of goat, and a hope that layering them would turn you into some kind of human onion. Spoiler, it didn't really work, and forget about snuggling under soft quilts. Beds were often nothing more than sacks stuffed with hay or straw, maybe with a few old rushes thrown in for good measure, and bonus, some fleas for extra company. Luxury, thy name is medieval peasant life. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Frostbite, hypothermia, and general freezing to death were constant risks, especially for young children and the elderly. Every morning that you woke up still breathing was considered a minor miracle, and honestly, worth celebrating. Maybe with a slightly less frozen turnip for breakfast. So yes, surviving a medieval winter wasn't about comfort. It was about gritting your teeth, piling on every piece of cloth you owned, huddling with your livestock, and praying you didn't wake up with icicles hanging off your eyebrows. And the real adventure? It was just beginning. If you think your apartment is drafty because the window doesn't close properly, medieval peasants would like a word. Their homes weren't just drafty, they were basically very enthusiastic wind tunnels with a roof. Most peasant houses were what historians politely call wattle and daub construction. Translation: sticks crisscrossed like a giant basket, smeared with a charming mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. Yes, dung. They weren't trying to be gross. Dung was a cheap, sticky insulator. Plus, it was always readily available, shall we say. These walls, no matter how lovingly smeared, didn't stand much chance against a proper winter storm. The cold wind found every crack, every gap, and gleefully danced its way into the one-room homes, swirling around and making sure you never got too comfortable. Privacy? Absolutely not. Warmth? Not really. Character building? Definitely. And then there were the roofs. Thatched roofs looked picturesque, sure, but after a few months of rain and snow, they sagged, leaked, and occasionally let in the local wildlife. Nothing says pleasant evening like a squirrel dropping onto your dinner. Windows, if they existed at all, were laughably tiny and usually covered with thin animal hides or wooden shutters. Glass was so expensive that even the lord of the manor probably couldn't afford more than a single tiny pane. And peasants. They were just happy if the wind didn't rip the cowhide right off the wall mid-blizzard. To make matters worse, floors were often just compacted dirt. When it rained or snowed heavily, mud seeped up through the ground, so technically you could say they had indoor water features. Not that they appreciated it. In winter, every step inside your own home could feel like trudging across a frozen marsh. Cold from below, cold from above, cold from inside. It was a three-dimensional assault on your body heat. But medieval peasants weren't the type to whine. They packed gaps with moss, jammed old rags into the worst drafts, and huddled close to each other. Human insulation at its finest. Creativity, stubbornness, and a bit of sheep grease rubbed into the walls were often the only things standing between them and becoming medieval popsicles. Because if your house was falling apart, and your best protection against the elements involved mud and goat hair, well, at least you could laugh about it. Sort of. If your teeth weren't chattering too hard. As if the freezing air wasn't enough, medieval peasants also had to battle a silent enemy rising from below, the frozen ground itself. Floors weren't really floors back then. They were just slightly flatter patches of earth inside your home. Maybe if you were lucky, someone had thrown down some straw or old rushes to give you the illusion of comfort. But make no mistake, you were sleeping one insulted back away from the cold, hard dirt. And oh, that cold was relentless. It seeped up from the earth like an evil little ghost, worming its way through the straw into your bones and straight into your very soul. If you dropped anything onto the floor during a winter night, congratulations, it was now part of the permafrost. Medieval peasants tried to fight this grim battle in a few ways. One method was layering thick mats of straw across the floor. If you could afford it, or more realistically, if you could steal enough of it from your neighbour's field without getting caught, you might have a decent insulating barrier. But straw flattened fast, got mouldy even faster, and added an extra crunchy soundtrack to your already miserable nights. Some homes layered dried rushes onto the dirt instead. Every so often they would throw fresh rushes on top without cleaning out the old ones. Over time, this created a fascinating ecosystem of decomposing plants, fleas, and whatever mystery creatures decided to move in. It was basically medieval carpet padding. If your carpet was alive, slightly damp, and smelled like a wet dog. Beds, for those who had them, didn't solve much. They were usually little more than wooden frames packed with, you guessed it, more straw or hay. Instead of cosy mattresses, you had poking, shifting, crunchy layers that did little against the cold radiating from below. Tossing and turning wasn't about comfort. It was a desperate, awkward dance to keep blood flowing and avoid freezing one side of your body. The truth is, medieval peasants didn't conquer the icy ground so much as learn to live uncomfortably above it. A good night's sleep wasn't about dreams or softness. It was about waking up with all your toes still attached. And if you could pull that off, hey, you were doing better than most. If medieval homes had a single hero during winter, it wasn't the roof, or the walls, or even the brave layers of dirt and dung insulation. It was the hearth, a crackling, stubborn fire pit that served as the only real defence against the cold, the darkness, and the general gloom of medieval life. At the centre of nearly every peasant home was a simple fire. No fireplace with a fancy stone mantel, no neat chimney sweeping the smoke skyward. Instead, you had a basic pit or pile of stones, some half-burned logs, and enough smoke pouring into the room to make you wonder if you were slowly becoming a ham. That's right. Most homes didn't even have chimneys. Smoke just kind of did its best. It drifted out through small holes in the roof, cracks in the walls, or right into your lungs if it was feeling lazy that evening. It wasn't ideal for breathing, or your overall lifespan. But on the bright side, it did a great job of fumigating fleas and other unwanted guests. Who needs pest control when you're marinating in smoke 24/7? The hearth wasn't just about warmth either. It was the kitchen, the light source, and sometimes even the medieval version of a television. people sat around the fire telling stories, gossiping, or just staring into the flames because, frankly, there wasn't much else to do after sunset. Keeping the fire alive wasn't just a nice idea, it was mandatory. Letting the fire die out at night was like putting up a sign for the cold to come in and finish you off. Plus, reigniting a fire in winter wasn't as easy as striking a match. You had to work with flint, steel, kindling, and more prayers than you'd ever offered before. Everyone in the family had a duty, stoking the flames, watching the embers, adding peat, sticks, or if you were lucky, a precious piece of dry wood. It was a constant battle between human persistence and the smothering cold that wanted nothing more than to snuff you out. The hearth didn't guarantee survival, but without it, survival was downright impossible. It was a smoky, sputtering, often disappointing little fire. But in a medieval winter, it was the beating heart of hope. If there was one thing medieval peasants feared more than running out of ale, it was letting the fire go out overnight. Without that warm, flickering lifeline, the cold would creep in faster than a tax collector after harvest. And in the dead of winter, restarting a fire from scratch wasn't just inconvenient, it could be deadly. Matches didn't exist yet. Lighters? Dream on. Rekindling a fire meant striking flint and steel together, praying for a single precious spark, and then coddling that spark with tender love and whatever dry kindling you hadn't already burned days ago. Imagine trying to do all this in the freezing dark, half asleep with frozen fingers. Now add a hungry wolf howling in the distance for extra motivation. So peasants got smart. They banked the fire. No, not in a cozy savings account. Banking meant carefully burying the embers under a mound of ash right before bed. The ash acted like a blanket, insulating the glowing coals and keeping them alive, just barely, until morning. If you did it right, you could stroll over at sunrise, poke the pile a little, add fresh wood, and, voila, fire without the frostbite. But if you did it wrong? Well, let's just say mornings got a whole lot colder and a whole lot grumpier. Fire banking was an art, passed down from parent to child like a prized family recipe. Everyone had their own little secrets. Some said use dry ash only, others insisted a bit of dampness was key. Some packed the embers tight, others let them breathe. You could practically start a medieval argument just by suggesting a better fire banking method. It was the ancient version of arguing over barbecue techniques, just with slightly higher survival stakes. Sometimes banking the fire wasn't enough. A howling wind might sneak through a crack and snuff it out anyway, or a clumsy sheep might stumble into the hearth. Yes, it happened. That's why some families took turns getting up in the night to check the coals, basically the medieval equivalent of sleepwalking to the thermostat. In the end, fire banking was less about mastering nature and more about buying just a few more precious hours of warmth. And if you woke up to even a single surviving ember, that was your victory, right there, and enough to face another day of battling the cold. In medieval times, the phrase, "the more, the merrier," wasn't just about parties. It was a winter survival tactic. When the fire sputtered and the freezing winds whistled through every crack, there was one surefire source of warmth, each other. And if that meant sleeping cheek to cheek with your entire family, neighbours, livestock, and possibly a very confused goose, so be it. Forget about personal space. Privacy wasn't even a concept. On the coldest nights, the goal wasn't comfort. It was, don't wake up frozen to the floor. Entire households piled into the warmest corner of the house, wrapped in whatever scraps of cloth they could find, and formed what could best be described as a desperate, snoring, human lasagna. Younger kids squeezed in between parents, grandparents snuggled under the outer layers, and if Cousin Ethel showed up unexpectedly, well, there was always room for one more. If you were lucky, you got to sleep in the middle, where body heat radiated from all sides. If you were unlucky, you were on the edge, the medieval equivalent of sleeping next to the door of a meat locker. And woe to the person who moved too much during the night. You shift once to get comfortable, and suddenly you've knocked Aunt Maud into the freezing draft by the wall. Congratulations, you're now the family villain. Sometimes even bedding was shared. A communal straw mattress that slowly flattened under the nightly weight of multiple generations. And because hygiene wasn't exactly winning any awards back then, let's just say it wasn't the most fragrant sleeping arrangement. But hey, when it's you versus frostbite, you stop being picky. Body heat wasn't just nice, it was strategic. Some medieval guides even recommended deliberately arranging the strongest, warmest people on the outside of the group, like human shields against the cold. Babies and frail elders were tucked deep in the centre, treated like the precious little heat generators they were. This wasn't just about survival, though. Over time, it became part of daily life, part of family bonding. Long winter nights huddled together led to storytelling, singing, and undoubtedly some very interesting conversations muffled under a shared wool blanket. So next time your sibling steals your blanket or your dog hogs the bed, just remember, at least you're not fighting for elbow space between a snoring uncle and a particularly judgmental goat. If you thought modern roommates were a challenge, medieval peasants would like to introduce you to their winter housemates: cows, goats, pigs, chickens, basically anything with a pulse and a little bit of body heat. Bringing animals indoors wasn't just a quirky village tradition, it was vital for survival. Livestock generated warmth, and in a poorly insulated hovel where the wind howled louder than your stomach, every little degree mattered. Plus, if your goat shared a wall with you, it was slightly less likely to get stolen by a neighbour in the dead of night. 2 birds, 1 stinky stone. At night, the house became a chaotic living furnace. Chickens nested in corners, pigs snorted near the hearth, and cows lounged luxuriously against the walls, chewing cud like they paid rent. It wasn't glamorous, far from it. If you've ever been stuck in a car on a summer road trip with someone who forgot to shower, imagine that. But it's a cow, it's winter, and there's literally nowhere else to go. The smells? Legendary. By springtime, the perfume of a shared winter was something fierce. You didn't need to light a candle. Your nostrils were already on a wild ride. But medieval peasants developed a selective nose. They didn't complain much because they knew one uncomfortable truth. The more animals inside, the fewer frozen toes in the morning. Certain animals even had prime spots. Cows, being the biggest and warmest, usually took centre stage near the family. Goats were allowed closer in for their warmth, and because goats, being goats, would find a way inside anyway. Chickens roosted in rafters or old baskets, and pigs, well, pigs didn't care. They plopped down wherever they pleased, probably right in the middle of the floor. Of course, sharing your bedroom with livestock wasn't without hazards. Imagine drifting off peacefully, only to be rudely awakened by a chicken deciding your hair makes a good perch, or stepping barefoot into something suspicious. First thing in the morning. Yes, medieval mornings could be full of surprises. Still, despite the noise, the smells, and the occasional hoof to the ribs, peasants understood the simple math. Cold kills, and cows cuddle, whether they want to or not. In the battle against winter's icy fingers, a warm, slightly slobbery cow breath was often the deciding factor between life and death. In medieval winters, fashion wasn't about looking good, it was about not dying. Peasants weren't flipping through the latest trends, they were layering up like they were preparing for battle against the Grim Reaper himself. The rule was simple: if you owned it, you wore it. Sometimes, all at once. First, the basic undertunic, a scratchy, probably not too clean linen shirt. Over that, a thicker woolen tunic, then another, if you had it. Add some leggings that sagged at the knees, a rough cloak draped over your shoulders, and, if you were really lucky, a patched-up sheepskin thrown on top like a prize trophy. Congratulations, you are now approximately 10% warmer and 90% itchier. Boots were a luxury. Many peasants wrapped their feet in layers of cloth or old rags and stuffed them into wooden clogs. If the cold still bit through, well, you just added another rag and hoped you didn't lose a toe. and forget about washing all these layers. Washing your clothes in the middle of winter meant dragging them to a frozen stream, smashing through the ice, and then waiting 2 days for your only shirt to dry, if it didn't just freeze into a tragic shirt cycle. Most peasants wisely decided that smelling like a mix of smoke, sweat, and sheep was a small price to pay for not freezing solid. Interestingly, the dirt and grease buildup had a bonus feature: insulation. That grimy layer locked in body heat. It was like a medieval Gore-Tex jacket, just smellier and far less socially acceptable today. Hats, scarves, and gloves were prized treasures. A simple woolen cap could mean the difference between making it through the night or waking up with hair frozen to the wall. Gloves were often homemade from whatever scraps of leather or fabric people could scrounge, sometimes looking more like sad puppet costumes than anything fashionable. Children were especially swaddled until they resembled overstuffed turnips, waddling awkwardly around the house. The goal was to trap as much precious body heat as possible. Style? Elegance? Never heard of them. Warmth was the real medieval flex. So, the next time you complain about layering up for a chilly day, just remember, medieval peasants walked around wearing half their wardrobe at once, looking like lumpy laundry bags, and counting themselves lucky for it. In the medieval peasant playbook, dirt wasn't just something you scrubbed off. It was practically a survival tool. As it turns out, getting grimy wasn't a sign you'd given up on life. It was tactical, strategic, dare we say, genius. See, winter posed a very specific problem: heat loss. Clean clothes, especially freshly laundered linen, were surprisingly terrible at keeping you warm. They were breathable, sure, but when the air temperature hovered somewhere between hypothermia and instant regret, breathable wasn't exactly a selling point. That's where dirt came in. As peasants trudged through day after day without washing their clothing, layers of grime, natural body oils, and good old-fashioned mud began to build up on their tunics, cloaks, and leggings. Over time, this natural armour clogged the tiny gaps in the fabric, making clothes more wind-resistant. It was like medieval weatherproofing, just smellier. Sure, you smelled like a goat who lost a bet, but guess what? You were warm. In fact, some medieval folks believed that washing yourself too often in winter could actually make you sick. Better to keep that protective, holy filth barrier intact. Bathing was rare, laundry even rarer, and soap, when it existed, was reserved for serious occasions, like when the bishop showed up, or maybe right before you died. Adding to the strategy, peasants layered their clothes without changing the ones underneath. You just threw your new layer on top of last month's. Eventually, you became a walking museum of the past 6 weeks. Every stain telling the heroic story of that one time I slipped in the mud but didn't die. To outside observers, medieval peasants might have looked and smelled like they had completely given up on hygiene. But the peasants knew better. That grimy, crusty tunic was a thermal shield against death by frostbite. It wasn't glamorous, but neither was freezing to death because you wanted to smell like flowers. Besides, in a world where literally everyone stank to high heaven, you weren't offending anyone. Nose blindness was practically a way of life. So yes, in medieval winters, filth wasn't failure. It was fashion. It was function. And if you had a thick, greasy outer layer by February, you, my friend, were winning at life. If you thought medieval peasants spent their winters tucked into plush featherbeds with embroidered quilts, think again. The reality was a bit more rustic. And by rustic, I mean, let's sleep on a pile of dead plants and hope for the best. Beds, in the medieval peasant world, were usually a rough wooden frame, if you could afford one, covered with a big sack stuffed full of straw, hay, or old rushes. That's it. No memory foam, no orthopedic support, no 5-star hotel experience. Just a crunchy, lumpy, slightly pokey mess that smelled faintly of barnyard and regret. Every toss and turn in the night brought a delightful soundtrack of crinkling straw, and the occasional sharp jab from a rogue stalk. Some peasants even skipped the wooden frame altogether and just threw the straw straight onto the dirt floor, creating a luxurious, ground-level sleeping experience that modern influencers would probably rebrand as earth-connected slumber. The straw mattresses weren't just uncomfortable, they were temporary. Over time, the straw flattened, grew mouldy, attracted bugs, and generally turned into a biological hazard zone. Changing the straw was a big event, usually done a few times a year if you were diligent, or whenever your bed started actively moving without your permission. Rushes were a popular alternative. These long grasses were spread thick on the floor, sometimes mixed with herbs like lavender or rosemary to mask the overwhelming odour livestock aroma of daily life. Fresh rushes smelled lovely, for about a day. After that, they became part of the muddy, trampled landscape inside the house, blending seamlessly with dirt, food scraps, and whatever else wandered in. And let's not forget the bedfellows. Fleas, lice, and other charming critters loved straw bedding almost as much as the peasants did. If you woke up scratching more than you slept, congratulations. You were living the authentic medieval experience. Despite the hardships, these humble beds were lifesavers. Piles of straw provided a crucial insulating layer against the frozen earth, and clumping together atop them created pockets of shared body heat, medieval central heating at its finest. So, next time you sink into your soft, supportive mattress, just remember, somewhere out there, a medieval peasant is looking down at you from history, grinning through a mouthful of missing teeth and saying, "Must be nice." When you live in a house made of sticks, mud, and optimism, you quickly learn that winter breezes aren't just a nuisance, they're personal attacks. Medieval peasants didn't just fight the cold from the outside, they fought it from inside their own homes, armed with nothing but whatever they could cram into the cracks. And trust me, there were a lot of cracks. Walls warped, mud crumbled, thatch sagged. The cold seemed to find new places to sneak in every night, like a mischievous poltergeist with a grudge. Sealing up the house became an art form. Peasants stuffed gaps with moss, straw, scraps of old cloth, bundles of dry grass, and sometimes even animal hair. If it was soft, squishy, or vaguely insulating, it was jammed into a hole somewhere. Some particularly determined souls daubed extra layers of mud and dung over the outside of their walls as an annual winter project. Imagine standing there in freezing weather, slapping cold manure onto your own house while muttering, "This is fine, this is luxury." Because in a way, it was. Roof leaks were another battlefield. Thatch, while cheap and plentiful, wasn't exactly waterproof, especially after a few seasons of rain and snow. Peasants would plug holes in the roof with spare bits of cloth, bundles of reeds, or, in moments of true desperation, chunks of turf stolen from the nearest field. Every home eventually started to look like a slightly sad patchwork quilt made by someone who gave up halfway through. Doors? Windows? If you had them, you were lucky. But even then, they were little more than wood planks hung by iron nails and sheer stubbornness. Window holes were often covered with animal hides or thick cloth soaked in animal fat to block out the worst drafts, and add a bonus aroma of mystery meat to the living space. Every night was a battle between human ingenuity and the relentless, sneaky cold. One minute you were warm, the next minute a sudden gust would find the one spot you missed, slapping you awake like a frosty hand of doom. Yet somehow, through cleverness, stubbornness, and a refusal to accept slightly frozen as a permanent state of being, medieval peasants patched, stuffed, and muddled their way through the worst winters nature could throw at them, one muddy handful at a time. When the cold bites hard enough to keep you awake at night, medieval peasants had a solution. Don't even try to pretend everyone's sleeping at once. Instead, they developed a survival strategy that today would make any military commander proud: sleeping in shifts. It wasn't some grand, organised system with whistles and roll calls. It was far simpler and much more desperate. Half the household stayed awake, tending to the fire and patching up stray drafts, while the other half curled up under threadbare blankets and hay, trying to catch a few precious hours of half-frozen sleep. The fire needed constant attention. Left alone, it would die down, and restarting it, remember, was about as easy as getting a stubborn donkey to dance. So someone had to be on ember patrol, and since no one wanted to get up once they were finally warm-ish, families rotated shifts. You dozed for a few hours, got elbowed awake, then stumbled over to the hearth to poke, prod and curse the fire back to life, while trying not to step on a goat. The rotation wasn't glamorous. There were no night vision goggles, no late-night snacks, and certainly no 5 more minutes snooze buttons. Just stiff joints, heavy eyelids, and a growing resentment toward whoever snored loudest during your shift. Children old enough to hold a stick were pressed into service, learning early that in winter, everyone pulled their weight, or froze trying. Grandparents sometimes stayed by the fire longer, both because of their experience and, frankly, because arthritis made lying down and getting up again a monumental event. And when it was your turn to sleep, good luck. With people moving about, animals rustling, wind battering the walls, and the occasional sharp nudge from a sibling who, accidentally, rolled over too hard, getting quality rest was a miracle. Yet despite the exhaustion, the system worked. Sleeping in shifts meant that there was always a set of eyes, and cold, begrudging hands, ready to keep the hearth alive. The embers survived, and by extension, so did the family. So next time you grumble about waking up to adjust the thermostat or let the cat out, spare a thought for the medieval peasant, squinting into a smoking fire at 3 a.m, wondering if toes were really that important after all. You know it's cold when you have to think about how you breathe just to stay alive. Medieval peasants didn't just battle the freezing air with cloaks, fires, and creative sleeping arrangements. They even adjusted the way they inhaled and exhaled to survive the night. The problem was simple. Deep, open-mouthed breathing pulled icy air straight into your lungs. In a world where pneumonia could kill you faster than you could say, "Hail Mary," that was a risk nobody wanted to take. So peasants learned the art of what you might call survival breathing. Instead of sucking in huge gulps of air like they'd just run a marathon, they kept their breathing shallow, slow, and, most importantly, through the nose. The idea was to gently warm the incoming air a bit before it hit their lungs. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than coughing yourself into the grave by February. If you accidentally took a big mouthful of cold air, congratulations. You just bought yourself a ticket to a week of hacking up bits of what felt like your soul, with no doctors in sight, and grandma treating you with hot onion tea and firm prayers. Some people even tucked parts of their cloaks, shawls, or rags up over their faces while they slept, creating a makeshift breath-warmer barrier. Of course, this also meant you ended up with a damp, slightly soggy fabric patch clinging to your mouth by morning, but hey, it beat freezing from the inside out. Children were taught these tricks early on. Parents would scold little ones for panting like dogs, indoors during the cold months. And honestly, between strict breathing lessons, itchy wool layers, and sleeping next to an aggressively gassy goat, medieval childhood winters were character building on a whole different level. At night, tucked into straw bedding under piles of cloaks, and next to a gently steaming cow, breathing became an art form. Slow, steady, nose only, and as minimal as humanly possible, like some grim medieval version of a yoga retreat, only with more frostbite and fewer inspirational quotes. In the grand survival playbook, it wasn't the flashiest strategy, but it worked. One shallow breath at a time, peasants endured another night in the long, relentless war against winter. In the endless battle against medieval winter, peasants discovered an unlikely secret weapon: a full stomach. Turns out, one of the best ways to fight off the cold wasn't another scratchy wool cloak. It was stuffing yourself with something hearty and heavy right before bed. Calories meant warmth. The more your body had to digest, the more it heated itself up doing the work. It's basic medieval thermodynamics. Eat a heavy meal, generate internal heat, and maybe, just maybe, survive until morning without turning into a peasant-shaped popsicle. So what did medieval peasants pile onto their plates before a long, freezing night? Think thick stews, heavy with root vegetables like turnips, onions and parsnips. Grains were lifesavers too. Oat porridge, barley gruel, or dense, chewy rye bread. If you were especially lucky, say, after a festival day or a generous slaughter, you might even get a hunk of salted pork or a slice of dried sausage thrown into the pot. This wasn't comfort food in the Instagram sense. No delicate presentation, no artisanal garnishes. It was one enormous, vaguely brown meal, designed to sit in your gut like a friendly brick, slowly burning through the night and keeping you just a little bit warmer. It wasn't just about eating a lot. It was about eating smart. Foods that took longer to digest provided a slow, steady trickle of warmth. Fatty foods were particularly prized, not just for the energy they provided, but because fat burns slower than lean meat. A belly full of stew, bread, and a questionable amount of lard. Peak medieval winter luxury. Parents made sure even the pickiest children ate heartily. Nobody cared if little Thomas didn't like turnips. You ate the turnips, or you shivered through the night thinking about how much you missed the turnips. Harsh but effective parenting. Medieval style. Of course, heavy nighttime eating came with its own hazards. You might be warmer, but you were also risking a night of vivid, bizarre dreams, fueled by a stomach trying desperately to process an entire field's worth of cabbages. Was it worth it? Absolutely. Because in the end, peasants weren't aiming for a Michelin star meal. They were aiming to survive. And if that meant going to bed full, bloated and breathing gently through your nose next to a steaming cow, well, that was just another night in the ongoing quest to see another frosty sunrise. Long before electric blankets and fancy heated mattress pads, medieval peasants had to get creative if they wanted a little extra warmth at bedtime. And that's how the humble haybox and the ever-glamorous heated stone became winter's unsung heroes. Let's start with the haybox. It sounds rustic, and it absolutely was, but the idea was pure genius. Peasants would take a sturdy wooden box, line it thickly with hay, and use it to store food that had been cooked earlier, keeping it warm for hours. Leftover stew, hot porridge, toss it into the hay box, cover it up, and it stayed hot enough for a late-night snack without needing to risk reigniting the fire. Medieval slow cookers, basically. But peasants didn't just stop at food. They realised if hay could trap the heat from a stew pot, it could also trap the heat from something even better. Rocks. Enter the era of the heated stone. Before heading to bed, someone, probably whichever unlucky child lost the family argument, would grab a flat stone and chuck it into the heart of the hearth fire. After roasting it until it was nearly too hot to touch, a fine line between helpful and third-degree burn, they'd fish it out using a stick or some old tongs. The stone, still radiating blissful warmth, would be carefully wrapped in rags, tucked into an old piece of cloth, or jammed into a clay pot, then slipped under the hay in the mattress or down at the foot of the bed. A medieval heating pad, ready to do battle against the frozen earth. Of course, there were risks. If you didn't wrap the stone properly, congratulations. You now had a small, localized house fire. And if you dropped it on your foot, well, let's just say winter injuries weren't always caused by slipping on ice. But when everything went right, that stone provided precious, comforting warmth that could last for hours. It wasn't luxurious, but when you lived in a half-frozen hut, luxury was defined as not waking up with icicles dangling from your nose. In the grand arsenal of medieval winter survival, a hot rock tucked into some hay might not sound glamorous, but for peasants clinging to whatever heat they could find, it was a tiny miracle. In a medieval peasant's home, the hearth wasn't just where you cooked dinner. It was practically a family member. A temperamental, smoky, sometimes uncooperative family member, sure, but still absolutely essential to survival, especially when it came time to sleep. The closer you were to the fire, the better your odds of waking up unfrozen. That meant sleeping arrangements were less about personal preference and more about strategic positioning. Infants, the elderly, and anyone sick or frail got first dibs on prime hearth real estate. Parents, older kids, and sturdier adults fanned out from there like human insulation layers. Being assigned a spot close to the fire wasn't just kindness, it was basic survival math. Babies were fragile heat generators, and elders were precious repositories of family knowledge, and, let's be honest, the best gossip. Protecting them with prime warmth was non-negotiable. But it wasn't all cosy toasting by the flames. Too close, and you risked waking up with your hair singed or your cloak smouldering suspiciously. Too far, and you were basically camping in an icebox. It was a delicate dance. Stay near enough to bask in the fire's glow, but not so near that you had to explain to your neighbour why you now looked like a half-cooked roast. The fire also didn't spread warmth evenly. It mostly roasted the people directly in front of it, while everyone else fought over the narrow cone of heat like cold lizards jostling for a sunbeam. If you were lucky enough to fall asleep facing the fire, you might have one blissfully warm side, and one side frozen so solid you could probably knock on it. Pets and livestock, of course, muscled in too. A dog might wedge itself between you and the fire, tail wagging dangerously close to open flame. Chickens sometimes perched perilously on hearthstones, clucking softly into the night like tiny feathery guardians of warmth. Every crackle of the logs, every shift of glowing embers was a tiny promise. You're still alive, you're still warm, for now. And so peasants drifted into uneasy sleep, lulled by the fire's pops and hisses, each breath forming small clouds in the frigid air beyond the fire's fragile circle. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't comfortable, but it was life, clinging to warmth by a thread of glowing coals. In the medieval world, no one survived winter alone, unless they wanted to become a very stylish frozen statue by January. Survival wasn't just a family affair. It was a village project, a messy, muddy, loud collaboration where everyone's warmth and life depended on everyone else. The peasants knew that in the dead of winter, a strong fire and a pile of hay could only do so much. If your neighbour's house went dark, you noticed. If the smoke from old Tom's hearth suddenly stopped curling into the sky, someone went to check. And not just because Tom owed you a chicken, though that might be part of it, but because community meant survival. Villages had unofficial winter watchers, often the young or the elderly, who couldn't work the fields, but could keep an eye on who was coughing too hard, who hadn't come to barter at the market in a few days, or whose home looked a little too still in the morning frost. These people were the medieval version of neighbourhood patrol, minus the reflective vests, plus a lot more sheep. If a family's fire went out, it was a near emergency. A good neighbour would rush over with a glowing coal bundled in rags, or better yet, invite them into their own smoky, overcrowded hut for the night. Yes, it meant squeezing an extra 4 bodies into an already cramped space, but it was better than finding frozen friends come spring thaw. Communal food stores played a role too. During especially brutal winters, villages sometimes pooled their last salted meat, grain, and dried vegetables. It was grim charity. No one had much, but a few communal meals could be the difference between staggering into spring or not. Even children understood the stakes. They helped deliver wood, shared embers, and ran urgent messages when someone needed help. No one was too small or too tired when winter came knocking. Sure, medieval villages weren't all sunshine and hugs. Feuds happened. Disputes over land, goats, or who borrowed whose good cooking pot never really went away. But when the nights grew deadly cold, old grudges were often quietly shelved. After all, a rival was still worth saving, because tomorrow it might be you needing rescue. In the icy heart of winter, the village became one big, stubborn family. Sometimes dysfunctional, often hilarious, always fiercely determined to survive together. One muddy boot, one crackling ember, one frozen smile at a time. When medieval peasants faced the merciless cold of winter, they didn't just pile on cloaks or stoke the fire. They prayed. A lot. Because when the wind howled like wolves outside your paper-thin walls and the fire shrank into sullen embers, you wanted every possible advantage, including a little divine intervention. Faith wasn't just a Sunday affair back then. It was woven into every frozen breath. Before crawling under layers of straw and scratchy wool, families would kneel together, offering up hurried prayers to keep the fire burning, the roof intact, and their toes attached by morning. Saints became more than distant holy figures. They were winter's frontline defence. Saint Blaise, for instance, was called upon to protect against throat ailments. Not a minor concern when one mouthful of icy air could land you coughing up your soul. St. Nicholas wasn't just the jolly gift-giver of later legend. He was also asked to protect households from sudden ruin during the lean, deadly months. Superstitions wrapped themselves snugly around daily survival. Some families sprinkled a little holy water near the hearth before sleeping, hoping it would protect against evil spirits, or at the very least, mischievous drafts. Others marked doorways with blessed chalk after certain feast days, pleading for warmth and luck to find their way inside. Candles played a role too. Special vigil candles, often blessed by the local priest or the most pious old woman in the village, were sometimes kept burning throughout the night, a flickering plea against the cold darkness clawing at the walls. And of course, no serious winter prayer session was complete without a few promises. Dear Lord, if you just get us through this night, I swear I'll be kinder to my neighbour, even the one who keeps stealing our turnips. Faith wasn't some abstract comfort. It was a daily, urgent conversation. The peasants weren't asking for luxury, just survival. A little heat, a little food, and one more day to muddle through until spring broke the frozen grip on their tiny villages. It was simple, raw hope, whispered into the smoky rafters, tangled in breathless prayers, and tucked under itchy blankets, that somehow carried them through the endless, merciless nights of winter. For all the ingenuity, prayers, and stubbornness medieval peasants threw at winter, the truth was chilling. Sometimes it wasn't enough. And when winter won, it didn't just take a few unlucky souls. It took entire families, whole villages, vanishing them into silence beneath a heavy shroud of snow and ice. Some winters were particularly cruel, like the infamous Great Famine Winter of 1315, when rains destroyed crops, livestock starved, and freezing temperatures turned an already brutal existence into a slow, grinding disaster. People were so desperate that stories whispered of eating shoe leather, bark, and, in the most horrifying cases, each other. Failure to keep the fire alive wasn't just an inconvenience. It was often a death sentence. Without the hearth's meagre warmth, families huddled together for the final time. Neighbours would sometimes stumble across whole households in spring, bodies still locked in one another's frozen embrace, as if trying to share just a little more heat until the very end. Houses themselves could collapse under the weight of heavy snow or battering ice storms. A roof giving way in the middle of a frozen night wasn't just catastrophic. It was often fatal. Dragging yourself through thigh-deep snow to beg shelter from neighbours wasn't a guarantee either, especially if those neighbours were already stretched to the breaking point. Disease loved the cold too. Starvation weakened the body, and cramped, smoky homes turned into breeding grounds for pneumonia, bronchitis, and other deadly infections. A simple cough in December could easily be a funeral by January. And then there was the quiet horror: frostbite. Fingers, toes, even ears blackened and died while still attached to their owners. Some villagers survived winters at the cost of their limbs, a grim badge of honour that said, "I made it through, but winter took a piece of me." Yet what's most haunting isn't just the death, it's the eerie normalcy of it. People accepted that each winter, some among them wouldn't see the thaw. Death wasn't unexpected. It was just another neighbour at the door, wrapped in frost, waiting its turn. Even amid the bitter cold and constant threat, medieval peasants pressed on, stubborn, grieving, clinging to life. Because as long as there was one ember left in the hearth, one breath hanging in the frozen air, there was still a fight worth fighting. When we look back at medieval peasants, those muddy, frost-bitten survivors of endless winters. It's tempting to see only their hardships, the cracked hands, the frozen toes, the smoke-choked huts. But buried beneath all that struggle is something far more powerful, a legacy of raw, stubborn ingenuity and unbreakable endurance. They didn't have central heating, thermal jackets, or cozy memory foam mattresses. They didn't even have the luxury of assuming they'd survive until spring. But what they did have, and what they left behind, was the blueprint for resilience. Every hay-stuffed mattress, every hand-banked fire, every moss-crammed wall gap was a testament to human creativity under pressure. Faced with impossible odds, they didn't collapse in despair. They adapted. They learned from the land, from each other, and from the bitter lessons carved by each brutal winter. Their communities were built on more than shared land. They were built on shared survival. They taught each other to watch over the sick, to pool resources when food ran low, to trust that helping a freezing neighbour today meant someone might help you tomorrow. They lived by the understanding that no one beats winter alone. Their faith, too, was a kind of endurance. They wove prayers into their daily lives, not just out of fear, but out of hope. Fragile, stubborn hope that tomorrow might be a little warmer, a little brighter. Hope that after 100 dark nights, spring would come again, and life would find a way to push through the frozen ground. And somehow, it did. Because of their sacrifices, because of their unglamorous victories, surviving one more night, one more storm, future generations thrived. Bit by frozen bit, they pushed humanity forward, enduring winters their ancestors could barely survive, until warmth and comfort became common expectations instead of distant dreams. Their blood, sweat, and ingenuity are stitched invisibly into the lives we live now. Every cozy blanket, every warm house, every lazy winter evening spent sipping tea under soft lights. All of it is the end result of countless medieval peasants refusing to give in to the cold. So the next time the wind howls outside your double-paned window, maybe spare a thought for them. The nameless, fearless ones who turned shivering survival into a living legacy. One ember, one breath, one stubborn heartbeat at a time. Anne Boleyn didn't come into the world with a crown on her head or armies at her feet. Born around 1501, likely at Blickling Hall or Hever Castle, she was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, a noblewoman with powerful family ties. In the grand scheme of Tudor society, Anne's birth barely stirred a ripple. Yet from these modest beginnings, something extraordinary was taking root. A life that would one day tilt the course of English history. From an early age, Anne was set apart not by her wealth, but by her mind. She was clever, spirited, and, by all accounts, magnetic. Recognizing her potential, her family sent her abroad to the continent, where her education truly began. First, she served Margaret of Austria in the glittering court of the Netherlands, an experience few English girls could dream of. There, Anne absorbed the art of diplomacy, refined manners, and the subtle dance of European politics. But it was in France that Anne's brilliance was truly polished. She spent years in the sophisticated courts of Queen Claude and Queen Marguerite of Navarre, learning the language of influence, elegance, flirtation, wit. While other young women perfected their embroidery, Anne mastered conversation, intrigue, and the art of commanding attention without ever seeming to seek it. By the time she returned to England in the early 1520s, Anne was something rare. A woman who could rival the sophistication of continental courtiers while carrying the ambition of a rising English house. She wasn't a classic beauty. Even her admirers admitted as much. But she was arresting. Dark eyes that sparked with intelligence, a quick, musical voice, a way of moving that suggested purpose just barely concealed beneath layers of courtly grace. Anne didn't just enter rooms, she changed their gravity. At a time when a woman's fate was often sealed by birth and marriage, Anne refused to drift quietly into obscurity. She had seen the power that charm and intellect could wield in foreign courts, and she intended to use that knowledge at home. Anne Boleyn was still a young woman then, clever, ambitious, untested. But history was already beginning to stir around her. The girl who returned to England was no longer just Thomas Boleyn's daughter. She was a player in a larger game, one that would soon engulf the crown itself. When Anne Boleyn returned to the English court, she was unlike anyone the nobility had ever seen. In a world full of pale-faced, modest English roses, Anne was a thunderstorm, electric, unpredictable, impossible to ignore. Her dark hair, bold eyes, and quick, sharp wit set her apart from the gentle, obedient ladies who filled the court of King Henry VIII. At first, she played the role expected of her, a maid of honour to Queen Catherine of Aragon. But even in the Queen's shadow, Anne's presence flickered like a candle too bright to snuff out. She danced gracefully, spoke French with the ease of a native, and laughed with a confidence few women dared display. Men noticed. Women gossiped. The court buzzed quietly about the striking Boleyn girl. It wasn't long before she caught the most dangerous attention of all, the king himself. Henry VIII was no stranger to flirtation. His court was a playground of whispered promises and secret liaisons. But Anne was different. She didn't swoon at his compliments or fall eagerly into his arms like so many others had. She teased. She challenged. She refused. Henry, a man used to instant adoration, was captivated. The more Anne held him at arm's length, the deeper he fell. Letters passed between them, filled with declarations of love, frustration, longing. Henry offered her the role of royal mistress, the most powerful unofficial position at court. Anne, astonishingly, said no. She would not be just another conquest, a forgotten mistress lost to time. If Henry wanted her, he would have to make her his wife. It was a gamble so audacious that it stunned the court. After all, the king was already married. His queen, Catherine, was beloved by the people and fiercely protected by her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor. The church itself would have to be defied for Henry to claim Anne. But Anne didn't flinch. She had lived in the courts of Europe, where queens wielded soft power from behind lace fans and painted smiles. She knew ambition was a dangerous game, but it was a game she intended to win. Standing in the candlelit halls of the English court, Anne Boleyn made her choice, not to be merely admired, but to change her destiny, and England's, forever. What began as an intense flirtation between King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn soon spiralled into a national crisis. Henry wasn't merely besotted, he was obsessed. And in his obsession, he was willing to tear apart everything England had known for centuries. The king's desire to marry Anne hit a small snag, namely, he was already married to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Catherine, dignified and resilient, refused to quietly step aside. She had been Henry's faithful wife for 2 decades, and in the eyes of God and the English people, she was the rightful queen. Divorce wasn't just scandalous, it was almost unthinkable. But Henry was determined. He convinced himself, and tried to convince everyone else, that his marriage to Catherine was cursed because she had once been married to his brother, Arthur. Never mind that the Pope had granted special permission for their union years ago. Henry now insisted that his soul was damned unless he annulled the marriage. Anne, for her part, knew better than to appear too eager. She kept herself just out of reach, alternately encouraging Henry's hopes and maintaining her distance. Every glance, every word was measured. She wasn't merely aiming for marriage. She was positioning herself to become Queen of England. The court erupted into whispers and factions. Some noble families eagerly courted Anne's favour, seeing the winds of power shifting. Others clung fiercely to Queen Catherine, horrified at the idea of Anne replacing her. Diplomats wrote desperate letters back to Rome. Foreign monarchs threatened retaliation. Henry's own advisers shifted uneasily, sensing the ground trembling beneath their feet. As months turned into years, Henry's frustration grew. He bombarded the Pope with petitions, manoeuvred his lawyers into finding loopholes, and slowly began to realise that the church would not bend easily. Catherine had powerful allies, including her nephew, Emperor Charles V, the most powerful man in Europe. Still, Henry pressed on, defying advice, tradition, and increasingly, the law itself. His courtship with Anne had become something far greater than personal desire. It was now a challenge to the very structure of England's political and religious life. Anne wasn't just capturing a king's heart. She was dragging an entire kingdom into uncharted waters. A dangerous game had begun, and there could be no turning back. After nearly 7 agonising years of manoeuvring, scandal and diplomatic chaos, Anne Boleyn's gamble paid off. In January 1533, she secretly married Henry VIII, a bold move, given that he was still, technically, married to Catherine of Aragon in the eyes of the Pope and much of Europe. By June, Anne was crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. It should have been the crowning moment of her life, but the atmosphere was far from universally joyful. The people of London watched with wary eyes. Some cheered, others muttered prayers for Queen Catherine. Many wondered if this new queen, with her French manners and daring spirit, was a blessing or a curse. Anne entered her queenship not as a beloved figure, but as a storm. Unlike Catherine, who embodied traditional English values of humility and piety, Anne was dazzling, provocative, and politically savvy. She wore bold colours, commanded the court with sharp intelligence, and made powerful enemies with breathtaking speed. Her position, while seemingly secure, was also terrifyingly precarious. Everything rested on one thing: providing Henry with a male heir. Anne knew this as keenly as anyone. She was not merely Henry's lover anymore, she was the hope of a dynasty. Early in her pregnancy, Anne and Henry were elated, certain the child would be a boy. But in September 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. To Anne's credit, she masked her crushing disappointment with grace, insisting the next child would surely be a son. Henry, however, was less composed. His eyes, once full of adoration, now flickered with doubt. Still, for a time, Anne's star burned brightly. She reshaped the English court in her image, elevating her family to unprecedented heights and becoming the first queen in English history crowned with the sacred oil usually reserved for kings. Her influence was vast. Foreign ambassadors sought her favour. Courtiers reshuffled alliances to be in her good graces. The once obedient Henry began moving England officially away from Rome, creating the Church of England with himself at its head, all so that Anne's crown could not be questioned. Yet even in her triumph, dark clouds gathered. Friends whispered behind their hands, rivals circled, waiting, and Henry, fickle and restless, was already beginning to look beyond the brilliant woman who had rewritten the kingdom for him. Anne had won the throne, but keeping it would demand more than charm, ambition, or even love. Anne Boleyn had climbed higher than almost any woman of her time. But the higher you rise, the harder the fall. Almost from the moment she placed the crown on her head, the cracks in her world began to show. At the heart of Anne's struggles was the pressure to produce a male heir. Her first child, Elizabeth, though bright and healthy, was not the son Henry VIII had hung his dynastic hopes upon, and the clock was ticking. Anne suffered multiple pregnancies in quick succession, but heartbreak followed, miscarriages that left her physically weakened and emotionally battered. Each lost child chipped away at the foundation she had built. Henry, once passionately devoted, began to pull away, his disappointment carving rifts between them. Anne, never one to suffer in silence, argued, demanded, fought to keep her place. But Henry, a man who prized obedience as much as beauty, grew tired of her sharpness, her defiance, the very fire that had once drawn him in. Outside the royal chambers, enemies were gathering like wolves. Many nobles who had tolerated Anne's rise with gritted teeth now openly schemed for her downfall. Catherine of Aragon's supporters never forgave Anne for what they saw as theft and sacrilege. Even commoners whispered against her, calling her the Great Whore, blaming her for the schism with Rome and the heavy-handed changes that followed. And then came Jane Seymour. Quiet, demure, everything Anne was not. Jane captured Henry's wandering attention just as Anne's influence began to wane. Where Anne had dazzled him with brilliance and challenge, Jane offered soothing compliance. It was a dangerous shift, and Anne, perceptive as ever, saw it happening. She tried to reclaim her position, lavishing attention on Henry, promising more sons, begging for patience. But the king, ever fickle, had already begun imagining life without the woman for whom he had once torn a kingdom apart. Anne's political enemies, including Thomas Cromwell, once her ally, sensed the changing tide. They began laying the groundwork for a campaign of destruction, quietly gathering accusations, rumours, and witnesses. The woman who had played the dangerous game of ambition so masterfully was now losing ground. Anne had won her crown through cunning and courage. But in the brutal, shifting world of Henry's court, past victories meant little. Only fresh success mattered, and Anne's enemies were sharpening their knives. The queen who had shattered a kingdom would soon see how quickly a kingdom could shatter her. Anne Boleyn's enemies didn't attack her with armies or swords. They came with whispers, secrets, and carefully sharpened lies. In the back rooms of court, betrayal was brewing. Silent, patient, deadly. Thomas Cromwell, once Anne's greatest ally in the English Reformation, had turned against her. Their alliance had been built on mutual ambition, but now their interests clashed. Anne wanted reforms to help the poor and limit the power of greedy nobles. Cromwell wanted stability, favour with Henry, and no interference. Anne's boldness had made her dangerous. And in Henry's fickle heart, love had curdled into irritation, suspicion, and cold detachment. Anne had few true friends left. Even her charm, once her greatest weapon, now grated against the court's hunger for a gentler, more pliable queen. And Jane Seymour, quiet and calculating, waited just out of sight, the perfect contrast to Anne's fading fire. It was Cromwell who moved first. Knowing Henry was restless, knowing that the king wanted an exit but lacked a convenient excuse, Cromwell offered a solution. What if Anne could be removed, not by divorce, which would humiliate Henry, but by disgrace? The accusations were wild, monstrous even. Adultery, incest, conspiracy against the king. Anne, the proud, brilliant queen, painted as a betrayer, a temptress, a threat to the very crown she once redefined. Cromwell carefully gathered evidence, coaxing confessions under torture, twisting courtly flirtations into damning testimony. Several men, including Anne's own brother, George Boleyn, were arrested. The charges made little sense. They were riddled with contradictions and impossibilities. But in Henry's court, truth was whatever the king needed it to be. Anne, sensing the tightening noose, fought desperately. She appealed to Henry's memory, to the love they had once shared. But it was no use. The man who had once torn England apart for her now refused to meet her eyes. In May 1536, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. As the great gates slammed shut behind her, she knew the truth. She was no longer a queen. She was a prisoner, a pawn trapped in the brutal game she had once played so masterfully. Betrayal had sealed her fate. And now, alone in the tower, Anne Boleyn waited for the final move. Anne Boleyn stood in the great hall of the Tower of London, facing a tribunal of nobles, many of whom owed their very titles and fortunes to her rise. Now, they sat in judgment, cold and watchful, prepared to erase the woman who had once changed the destiny of England. The charges against her were shocking. Adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. High treason. Conspiracy against the king. In another world, such accusations against a queen would have been unthinkable. But here, now, they were simply theatre. A grim performance designed to give Henry VIII exactly what he wanted. Anne's downfall, wrapped in a thin veil of legality. Anne defended herself with the same fire that had once won Henry's heart. She denied every accusation with intelligence, precision, and an unwavering composure that astonished even her enemies. She reminded them that she had been crowned with sacred oil, chosen by God, and anointed as Queen of England. She reminded them of her loyalty, her sacrifices, her love. But it was all for nothing. The verdict had been decided long before Anne set foot in the courtroom. The trial was a spectacle for the court and for the people, a public unmaking of a once unbreakable woman. Witness after witness, many coerced or bribed, spoke damning words. Dates and places contradicted each other. Evidence was flimsy when it existed at all. But the truth was irrelevant now. Anne was found guilty. Her brother George and the other men accused with her were sentenced to death as well. Anne would be executed by beheading, a merciful sentence compared to the usual traitor's death of hanging, drawing, and quartering. When the verdict was read, Anne did not break. She stood tall, her face pale but her spirit fiercely intact. In those final moments before being led back to her cell, she spoke clearly, declaring that she was prepared to die, and prayed that God would have mercy on her soul. As the heavy doors of the hall closed behind her, the court exhaled in relief. The storm Anne had been, brilliant, dangerous, unforgettable, was nearly over. But even then, they did not understand. They were not erasing Anne Boleyn. They were immortalizing her, in betrayal, in tragedy, and in legend. After her trial, Anne Boleyn was returned to the Tower of London, not as the triumphant queen who had once commanded England, but as a condemned prisoner awaiting death. Yet even facing the end, Anne refused to crumble. In the cold, echoing halls of the tower, Anne prepared herself. She spent hours in prayer, kneeling on the hard stone floors, her hands clasped tightly, her voice steady. She confessed to no crimes because she believed she had committed none. She was not afraid to die, she said, but she prayed that her death would bring peace to the kingdom, and perhaps mercy to her little daughter, Elizabeth. Her ladies-in-waiting, those few who had stayed loyal, wept in private. Anne comforted them instead of the other way around. She joked bitterly at times, that she would be remembered as a queen who had lost her head. In her dark humour was the stubborn spark that had made her unforgettable. Henry VIII, meanwhile, showed no sign of mercy. He had already turned his attention to Jane Seymour. Even before Anne's execution date was finalised, Henry was arranging his next marriage. For Anne, this final betrayal, from the man who had once torn down a kingdom for her, must have been the deepest cut. On May 18th, 1536, Anne was told she would die the next morning. She slept little that night. Instead, she spent her final hours in prayer, asking God for forgiveness for all who had wronged her, and perhaps for herself, for the ambition and pride that had led her here. Henry, with a flicker of royal kindness, had arranged for a French swordsman to carry out the execution, faster, cleaner, less brutal than an axe. It was a small mercy, bought perhaps more for the king's conscience than for Anne's comfort. At dawn, Anne dressed carefully for her final moment. A dark grey gown of damask trimmed with fur, a crimson kirtle beneath, colours of dignity, of sacrifice. She pinned up her dark hair and tucked it beneath a simple cap, ready to face the blade with grace. As the tower's cold morning mist curled around the courtyard stones, Anne Boleyn, queen, mother, survivor, fighter, stepped forward. There would be no tears, no pleas, only a final act of courage in the face of history's judgment. Her end was near. But her story was just beginning. On the morning of May 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn ascended the scaffold built within the Tower of London's walls. A small crowd gathered, courtiers, guards, a few witnesses, all wrapped in silence, as if even the stone walls held their breath. Anne stood tall, her grey gown fluttering slightly in the cold morning breeze. She looked thinner than she had at court, her face pale but calm. There were no hysterics, no broken sobs. If anything, she faced death with the same fierce dignity that had once shaken a kingdom to its knees. She spoke briefly, carefully choosing her final words. She did not accuse. She did not defend herself. She prayed for the king's health and prosperity, the very man who had abandoned her. In those final moments, Anne offered the world not a confession, but forgiveness. Her courage stunned even those who had come to see her fall. The French executioner, brought specially to ensure a swift death, stepped forward. Anne knelt upright, her hands folded in prayer, her eyes lifted toward the heavens. A small white cloth was tied around her eyes. She remained still. The sword flashed once, silent, swift, and Anne Boleyn, queen, mother, history maker, was no more. She was buried quickly in an unmarked grave within the Tower grounds, laid to rest in an arrow chest because no proper coffin had been prepared for her. A queen once crowned in gold, now left to vanish without ceremony. Yet Anne's story didn't end in that cold grave. Her daughter, Elizabeth, the child whose birth had once disappointed a king, would rise to become one of the greatest monarchs in English history. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, whose reign would see the flowering of English art, power, and global influence. A queen who inherited her mother's fierce spirit, sharp mind, and unyielding resilience. Anne Boleyn changed the course of England forever. Her ambition helped trigger the break with Rome and the birth of the Church of England. Her fall showed the world that even queens could be cast aside. Yet through her blood, through Elizabeth, Anne's legacy blazed brighter than any crown she had worn in life. In the end, Anne Boleyn won a kind of immortality, not through her survival, but through her indelible impact on history. By the early 1770s, the American colonies simmered like a pot left too long over a roaring fire. The relationship with Britain, once seen as the proud mother country, had soured into resentment, suspicion, and growing fury. It hadn't started with tea. Years earlier, the Stamp Act had enraged colonists by placing taxes on everything from newspapers to playing cards. That was followed by the Townshend Acts, taxing essentials like paper, glass, and paint. Each new law, passed thousands of miles away by a parliament in which the colonists had no representation, was like another spark landing in dry brush. At first, the anger showed itself in polite petitions and fiery pamphlets. Colonial assemblies drafted formal protests. Merchants organised boycotts. Writers like Samuel Adams and John Dickinson filled newspapers with passionate arguments about liberty and rights. But as time wore on, frustration deepened into something darker. A slow realisation that Britain wasn't listening. Worse, Britain didn't care. Many colonists clung to the hope that if they just made enough noise, if they just reasoned hard enough, Parliament would repeal the taxes. And sometimes they did. The Stamp Act was famously repealed after loud colonial protest. But every small victory was followed by new legislation, new taxes, new insults. It wasn't about the money. It never really was. The taxes themselves were modest by British standards. What infuriated the colonists was the principle. They were being taxed without consent, treated as subjects rather than citizens, ruled like distant possessions rather than partners. Boston, more than any other city, became the beating heart of resistance. The Sons of Liberty, a secretive, fiery group of patriots, grew louder and bolder. In 1770, tensions exploded into violence when British soldiers fired on unarmed civilians in what became known as the Boston Massacre. Blood had already stained the cobblestones. Trust was a thing of the past. By 1773, the colonies were teetering on the edge. A final insult would tip them into open defiance. And it came, not in the form of soldiers or new laws or armies, but in the quiet, seemingly harmless shape of crates stacked with tea. The colonists didn't know it yet, but the night that tea floated in the cold waters of Boston Harbor, the world would change forever. In 1773, Parliament made a critical miscalculation. Believing the American colonies would quietly accept cheaper tea, they passed the Tea Act, a law that was supposed to save the struggling British East India Company and, incidentally, reassert Britain's right to tax the colonies. On paper, it looked like a good deal. The Tea Act allowed the company to sell tea directly to the colonies, cutting out the middlemen, slashing prices, and offering a luxury product at a bargain. A few pennies cheaper. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Because the problem wasn't the price of tea, it was the principle behind it. The Tea Act left the hated tax on tea firmly in place. Accepting the tea, even at a discount, would mean acknowledging Parliament's right to tax the colonies without their consent. To many Americans, that was unthinkable, a surrender of the liberties they had fought to protect for more than a decade. The news of the Tea Act spread like wildfire through the colonies. Merchants fumed. They saw their livelihoods threatened by a monopoly that would crush local trade. Patriots raged at the hidden message. The Crown still believed it could do whatever it pleased. In Boston, the reaction was especially fierce. Already a city scarred by the Boston Massacre and years of economic hardship, Bostonians recognized the Tea Act for what it was, a trap disguised as a bargain. Refusing the tea became a matter of honor, a litmus test for loyalty to the cause of liberty. Public meetings swelled. Newspaper columns burned with fiery rhetoric. Groups like the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams and others, organized boycotts, vowing that no East India Company tea would be unloaded, sold, or drunk on American soil. All across the colonies, ships carrying the controversial tea were turned away by local resistance. In ports from New York to Charleston, the message was clear. We will not be bought. But in Boston, fate twisted differently. 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, arrived, anchored in the harbour, and sat there, refusing to leave. Royal officials insisted the tea be unloaded. The colonists refused. A deadlock grew, taut as a drawn bowstring. The tension was unbearable. A single act would break it, and history would never be the same again. As the British tea ships sat stubbornly anchored in Boston Harbour, the city itself transformed into a powder keg. Every day that passed without resolution tightened the tension. Boston wasn't just resisting, it was preparing for a fight. In taverns, churches, and public squares, angry colonists debated what to do. The Sons of Liberty, led by fiery voices like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere, moved swiftly to organize resistance. They posted public notices calling on citizens to boycott British tea and held raucous meetings that swelled with farmers, artisans, and merchants alike. Each gathering added fuel to the fire. The Old South Meeting House became the nerve center of the resistance. Thousands crammed into the wooden hall, their breath fogging the air, their voices rising in defiance. Here, resolutions were passed, speeches were made, and tempers boiled. Each vote against the unloading of tea was another hammer blow against British authority. But while the people of Boston stood united, the clock was ticking. British law demanded that imported goods, like tea, be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days. If the ships remained after the deadline, customs officials would seize the cargo and the tax would be collected by force. The Sons of Liberty understood that once the tax was paid, even under protest, the principle would be lost. It wasn't just about the tea anymore. It was about whether the colonies would accept being treated as subjects without rights, or whether they would stand and fight for their future. Meanwhile, the Royal Governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, dug in his heels. He refused to let the tea ships leave without unloading their cargo, demanding that the law be obeyed, colonial outrage be damned. To him, backing down meant admitting that mobs, not monarchs, ruled the colonies. Boston's standoff became a spectacle. Every man, woman, and child knew that something was coming. You could feel it in the air, that cold, sharp sense before a storm when the world holds its breath. All it would take was one spark to ignite an explosion. and somewhere among the crowded streets and crowded hearts of Boston, a decision was quietly taking shape, a plan that would echo across oceans and empires. December 16th, 1773, dawned grey and cold over Boston, a city balanced on the edge of history. For nearly 3 weeks, the tea ships had sat in the harbour like ticking bombs. Now, the final deadline had arrived. According to British law, the tea had to be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days of a ship's arrival. If it wasn't, customs officials could seize the cargo, and British troops could be called in to enforce the law. Everyone knew it. Everyone knew what was at stake. If the tea came ashore, the principle was lost. If the colonists allowed it, even once, their cause, their claim to rights and liberty, would unravel. That morning, thousands of Bostonians and nearby colonists packed into the Old South Meeting House, the largest building in town. Some had walked miles through the icy countryside to be there. The meeting was so packed that men spilled out into the streets, straining to hear the fiery speeches echoing through the halls. Samuel Adams, the iron voice of rebellion, presided over the gathering. Speaker after speaker rose to denounce the Tea Act, to cry out against tyranny, to urge immediate action. But even among the defiants, uncertainty hung heavy. What could be done without sparking outright war? How could they stop the tea without opening the floodgates to brutal retaliation? As the afternoon wore on, riders galloped in with grim news. Governor Thomas Hutchinson remained unmoved. The ships would not be allowed to leave without unloading. The tea would be seized, the tax collected, the king's law enforced. The crowd buzzed with fury. The walls of the meeting house seemed to shudder with the force of it. Yet Samuel Adams stood calmly and spoke the words that signalled the end of debate. This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. A simple sentence. But everyone knew what it meant. There would be no more petitions, no more compromises. Action would be taken. Outside, a war whoop cut through the gathering gloom, the signal. Men disguised themselves quickly, smearing soot on their faces, donning blankets and feathers in crude imitation of Mohawk warriors. It wasn't about fooling anyone. It was about creating a symbol, a message no one could mistake. The deadline had passed. Boston would answer not with words, but with defiance. As twilight deepened over Boston on December 16, 1773, the quiet streets began to stir. Figures moved through the shadows. Ordinary men cloaked in rough blankets, their faces blackened with soot, some adorned with feathers. They weren't trying to fool anyone into believing they were real Mohawks. Their disguise was symbolic, an act of shedding their old identities, of taking a stand as something new, something fierce. By the dozens, they made their way to Griffin's Wharf, where the 3 tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, lay anchored. The harbour water churned cold and dark beneath them, thick with the sharp bite of winter air. There was no shouting, no drunken chaos. This was not a riot. It was a mission, carried out with calm, ruthless precision. Armed with hatchets and clubs, the disguised colonists swarmed the ships, overwhelming the few crew members still aboard. No harm came to the sailors. They were pushed aside, watched in silence as the operation began. Men split open the wooden chests with practiced blows, the fragrant smell of fresh tea spilling into the cold night air. Others heaved the crates overboard, their heavy splashes echoing across the still waters of the harbour. Chest after chest, 342 in total, was broken and dumped, until the black water swirled with thousands of pounds of tea leaves. Spectators watched from the wharf, silent, awed. British guards stationed nearby made no move to intervene. Whether from confusion, sympathy, or fear of escalating violence remains unclear. Some accounts suggest that even among British loyalists there was an understanding. Something had shifted, and there would be no stopping it tonight. The discipline was extraordinary. No cargo was stolen. No one raided the ships for valuables. Only the tea, the hated symbol of British oppression, was targeted. In a town where hunger and hardship were daily realities, the men could have easily turned the protest into an excuse for looting. They did not. When it was over, the harbour resembled a great, swirling cauldron, filled with torn chests and soaking tea leaves. The smell of the sea mixed with the sharp tang of smashed tea, filling the night air with a strange, bittersweet scent. The work was done. Silently, the men disappeared into the night, vanishing into the alleys and back streets of Boston. They left behind no names, no leaders, no claims to fame, only the unmistakable mark of revolution. As the last broken crates bobbed in the dark water, Boston stood still, almost holding its breath. The Boston Tea Party wasn't a riot, a brawl, or a drunken spectacle. It was something far rarer, an act of cold, deliberate defiance carried out under the cloak of night. The harbour was transformed into a giant, swirling teapot. Thousands of pounds of East India Company tea floated in great mats on the water, staining it black. Some colonists, curious and rebellious, scooped handfuls of soaked leaves from the harbour, only to be chastised by the Sons of Liberty patrolling the docks. Nothing was to be salvaged. No one would profit from this night's work. This was principle, pure and simple. The town woke the next morning to the smell of salty tea hanging heavy in the air. News spread like wildfire. Word of mouth, letters, broadsheets. By midday, everyone from apprentices to merchants knew what had happened, and opinions split fast. Among patriots, there was pride, a fierce, swelling pride that ordinary men had stood up to the mightiest empire in the world and struck a blow for liberty. Among loyalists and moderates, there was horror. To them, the destruction of property was reckless, dangerous. Had the colonies crossed a line they couldn't walk back from? Governor Thomas Hutchinson raged in his mansion, furious not only at the destruction but at the message it sent. If the king's authority could be defied so brazenly in Boston, where else might rebellion spark? British officials were stunned. They had expected protests, boycotts, maybe another riot like those that had broken out over the Stamp Act. They hadn't expected organised, disciplined revolutionaries to calmly destroy tens of thousands of pounds of royal property without so much as breaking a window. The ship's captains, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, the Beaver, could only watch helplessly as their cargo disappeared beneath the waves. In the official ledgers, the night's loss would be tallied at over 10,000 British pounds, a fortune. But the real loss wasn't measured in pounds sterling or ruined tea. It was measured in trust, in loyalty, in the fragile illusion that Britain still ruled her colonies with consent. The night the tea sank, something deeper rose to the surface, a shared undeniable truth. The age of peaceful protest was ending, a reckoning was coming, and Boston was ready. When word of the Boston Tea Party crossed the Atlantic and reached London, the reaction was swift and furious. To British officials, it was not simply a protest, it was rebellion, an open, mocking challenge to royal authority that could not be ignored. King George III, upon hearing the news, was said to have grown cold with anger. Parliament, already frustrated by years of colonial disobedience, exploded in outrage. They demanded punishment, not just for the city of Boston, but as a warning to all the American colonies. The result was a series of laws so harsh they were quickly nicknamed the Intolerable Acts in America. The first blow came swiftly, the Boston Port Act. In one brutal stroke, Parliament ordered the closure of Boston's bustling harbour, the economic lifeline of the city, until the destroyed tea was paid for and order restored. Ships could no longer enter or leave. Trade vanished. Goods and supplies dried up. Boston, once vibrant and noisy, grew quiet, its docks eerily still. But the punishment didn't stop there. The Massachusetts Government Act stripped the colony of its self-governing rights, placing it firmly under the king's appointed officials. The Administration of Justice Act allowed royal officials accused of crimes to be tried back in Britain, a clear message that British authorities were untouchable. And to make sure the colonies knew force was an option, British soldiers were quartered throughout Boston, living among the very citizens they were meant to subdue. The message was clear. Rebellion would be crushed. Liberty was a luxury the Crown would no longer tolerate. But Parliament's heavy hand had an unintended effect. Instead of frightening the other colonies into submission, it outraged them. News of Boston's suffering, of its port closed, its people starving under martial law, stirred deep sympathy and righteous anger throughout America. Wagon loads of food and supplies poured into Boston from neighboring colonies. Letters of support, pledges of unity, and secret meetings began to weave the once fragmented colonies closer together. What had once been a Massachusetts problem was rapidly becoming an American one. In punishing Boston, Britain had hoped to make an example of them. Instead, they made Boston a symbol, a rallying cry for resistance. The flames of revolution, once flickering in isolated pockets, now began to blaze from colony to colony. And there would be no easy extinguishing them. The punishment of Boston sent shockwaves far beyond the rocky shores of Massachusetts. Across the 13 colonies, outrage turned into something far more dangerous for Britain: unity. For years, the colonies had acted like distant cousins, bickering and competing, separated by geography, religion, and trade rivalries. But when Parliament slammed Boston's harbour shut and stripped Massachusetts of its self-governance, Americans across the continent realized if it could happen to Boston, it could happen to anyone. From Virginia to Pennsylvania, South Carolina to New Hampshire, the response was swift. Colonists sent wagons full of food, supplies, and letters of solidarity to the suffering people of Boston. Town meetings buzzed with anger. Newspaper printers worked day and night to spread the news. The fight was no longer Boston's alone. It was everyone's. And so, in September 1774, something unprecedented happened. The First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. For the first time, representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered under one roof to discuss a unified response. Men like George Washington, Patrick Henry, John Adams, and Samuel Adams, once merely regional figures, now stood together as architects of a movement that was growing larger by the day. Their goal, at least officially, was not yet full independence. Most still hoped for reconciliation, for a return to the old relationship of mutual respect under the British Crown. But beneath the polite debates and carefully worded petitions, a deeper understanding was taking root. The colonies could no longer afford to stand separately. At the Congress, they agreed to a sweeping boycott of British goods. They pledged mutual support in the face of further British aggression, and they made it clear any attack on one colony would be considered an attack on all. In taverns and meeting houses across the continent, ordinary people began using words that had once been whispered only in private: unity, resistance, liberty. In bringing the hammer down on Boston, Britain had imagined it would crush rebellion. Instead, it had welded the colonies together into something far more dangerous, a people who, despite their differences, were beginning to think of themselves not as scattered provinces, but as Americans. The winds of revolution were no longer just stirring. They were gathering into a storm, and it was too late for Britain to stop it. The night the tea sank into Boston Harbour, it wasn't just crates that were destroyed. It was the illusion that the American colonies could remain loyal subjects forever. The Boston Tea Party lit a spark that no king, no army, no distant parliament could ever snuff out. In the months that followed, that spark caught fire across the colonies. What had once been protests, boycotts, and polite petitions hardened into open resistance. Town militias began drilling openly. Storehouses filled with powder and shot. Men who had once toasted King George III in taverns now whispered about revolution under the same roofs. Boston became a symbol of sacrifice, battered but unbowed. The more Britain tried to tighten its grip, the more the colonies slipped through its fingers. Every ship that sailed past the closed, silent harbour of Boston was a silent reminder that tyranny had met its match in American defiance. When Parliament passed the Intolerable Acts, they intended to make an example out of Boston, to scare the other colonies into submission. Instead, they had created a martyr city, a rallying cry. From Georgia to New Hampshire, colonists realized that their fates were tied together. Resistance was no longer about tea. It was about survival, identity, freedom. By the spring of 1775, the tension reached a boiling point outside Boston, in the villages of Lexington and Concord. British troops, sent to confiscate colonial weapons, instead found armed farmers, ordinary men ready to defend their rights with musket fire. The first shots of the American Revolution rang out, a direct line traced back to the moment when men chose principle over profit and dumped a fortune's worth of tea into the harbour. The Boston Tea Party showed the world that revolution doesn't always announce itself with trumpets and banners. Sometimes it starts quietly, with a small group of determined people standing in the cold, choosing defiance over fear. In dumping the tea, the colonists weren't just rejecting a tax. They were rejecting an empire. And though the road ahead would be bloody, bitter, and uncertain, one thing had become clear that night in Boston Harbour. The American colonies were no longer loyal subjects. They were something new, something dangerous. They were revolutionaries. And they were just getting started. All before the towering pyramids of Giza, before Mesopotamian cities buzzed with life, before Stonehenge stood against the sky, there was Corral. Hidden away in the dry valleys of coastal Peru, Corral rose in silent majesty nearly 5,000 years ago, then faded into near-complete oblivion, swallowed by sands and forgotten by history. For centuries, the world did not even know it existed. The Super Valley, where Corral once thrived, seems at first glance an unlikely place for civilization to bloom. The landscape is parched, barren, the river little more than a thin silver thread winding through rocks and dust. To most eyes it looked inhospitable, a place abandoned by life. Yet it was here, amid the desolation, that one of humanity's earliest great cities took shape. Corral wasn't just a collection of scattered huts or a temporary trading post. It was a planned city, sprawling over 150 acres, filled with pyramids, plazas, residential quarters, and ceremonial spaces. It had scale, purpose, and vision, a complex society blossoming centuries before the Egyptians began stacking stones into pyramids of their own. The people of Corral achieved this without the wheel, without written language, without metal tools. They built massive structures from stone and earth with nothing but ingenuity, communal effort, and the raw power of human will. Yet for thousands of years, Corral's existence remained a secret. Even when travellers stumbled across the strange, weathered mounds scattered across the valley, they mistook them for natural formations, mere hills sculpted by the desert winds. No one imagined that beneath the sand lay one of the oldest cities in the world, predating even the civilizations that history books had crowned as the firsts. It wasn't until the late 20th century that archaeologists, led by Ruth Shady, uncovered the truth. What they found buried in the dust of time would rewrite the story of the Americas and force the world to reconsider what it thought it knew about the birth of civilization itself. Corral had risen, flourished, and fallen in total anonymity. Now, after millennia of silence, its stones are speaking again, whispering of a peaceful, intelligent people who built a world of complexity and wonder in a land where life itself seemed impossible. And this was only the beginning of their story. At first glance, the Supi Valley looks like a place where life should struggle to exist. Harsh winds sweep across endless stretches of sand and stone. The sun beats down mercilessly, drying out the earth, baking the landscape into cracked, brittle sheets. Water is scarce, the river a meandering thread fighting for survival. To the untrained eye, it is a wasteland, barren, empty, forgotten by the gods. But the people of Corral saw something different. They did not see a desert to be feared. They saw a canvas to be shaped. They recognized the river, however modest, as the lifeblood of possibility. And so, with patience, ingenuity, and sheer determination, They turned this unforgiving place into a thriving oasis of life and culture. Their first victory was agriculture. They learned to tame the river's seasonal floods, building simple but brilliant irrigation systems that channeled water across the valley floor. Where others saw sand and dust, they coaxed green shoots of hope: cotton, beans, squash, guava, sweet potatoes. Cotton, in particular, became their treasure. It was spun into fishing nets and textiles, fueling trade with coastal villages and creating bonds that stretched far beyond their desert home. But growing crops was only part of their mastery. The people of Corral understood that survival in the desert required balance. They worked with nature, not against it. They built their homes and plazas from stone and earth, designed to withstand both scorching heat and the rare, punishing rains that occasionally swept through the valley. They studied the stars and seasons, planning their harvests with the precision of master astronomers. Trade became the veins and arteries of Corral's economy. Dried fish, cotton, fruits, and handmade goods flowed up and down the coast. In exchange, Corral received exotic goods: colourful shells from the Pacific, rare stones from the Andes, ideas from distant peoples. They were not isolated, they were connected. In a land where survival seemed impossible, Corral thrived through intelligence, innovation, and community. They didn't conquer the desert with brute force. They partnered with it, learning its rhythms, respecting its power, building a society that was not just functional, it was extraordinary. Against the odds, Corral blossomed into a beacon of civilization. And it was only beginning to rise. Rising out of the desert like ancient guardians, the pyramids of Corral defy everything we thought we knew about early civilization in the Americas. These were not small, crude structures built by primitive hands. They were massive, deliberate works of architecture, created by a people with vision, organization, and ambition. The centerpiece of the city was the Pyramid Mare, the largest of Corral's monumental structures. It stretched more than 450 feet in length and towered nearly 60 feet above the desert floor, a feat of engineering on par with the early wonders of the ancient world. Built from stone, mud, and woven reed bags filled with rocks, the pyramid was designed not just to endure the harsh climate, but to withstand the punishing earthquakes that occasionally rattled the region. And endure it did, standing silent against wind and time for nearly 5 millennia. But the pyramids of Corral were not tombs. Unlike the massive burial complexes of Egypt, Corral's pyramids served a different purpose. They were centers of ceremony, power, and public life. Temples and gathering spaces crowned their summits, accessible by broad, elegant staircases. Fires once burned atop these platforms, and rituals were held beneath the endless Peruvian sky. At the foot of the pyramids, vast plazas opened up, sunken and circular, inviting thousands to gather for religious ceremonies, political meetings, and communal celebrations. The very design of Corral's cityscape suggested a society that prized community and order, a people deeply connected to one another and to the cosmos. Around the pyramids, smaller residential complexes fanned out, likely home to priests, administrators, artisans, and farmers. The pyramids themselves seem to have been strategically placed, aligned with celestial events, sunrises, solstices, the cycles of the stars. To the people of Corral, architecture wasn't just practical, it was spiritual, mathematical, cosmic. Walking among the weathered stones today, it's almost impossible not to feel a strange sense of awe. These structures were raised without metal tools, without the wheel, without beasts of burden. Yet they rose with symmetry, scale, and staggering precision. The great pyramids of Corral were not built for vanity, nor for war. They were built to connect earth and sky, community and cosmos, humanity and eternity. And they still whisper across the sands, telling a story that refuses to be forgotten. Among the ruins of Corral, there is something profoundly different, something that sets it apart from so many ancient civilizations. No weapons have been found buried beneath its sands. No defensive walls circle its plazas. No mass graves hint at bloody conquest or internal strife. Unlike the kingdoms that rose and fell through war, Corral was a society built on peace. It's a revelation that defies expectations. Here was a civilization that flourished not through violence, but through cooperation, trade, and shared belief. The people of Corral seem to have invested their energy not in armies or fortresses, but in architecture, astronomy, music, and communal life. Their plazas and pyramids weren't monuments to victory over enemies. They were centers of celebration, worship, and governance. This was a civilization that chose to gather rather than conquer, to negotiate rather than destroy. Trade was the lifeblood of Carroll's success. Cotton, grown along the fertile riverbanks, was spun into fishing nets that were traded with coastal communities. In return, Carroll received dried fish, an essential source of protein, and exotic goods from faraway places, colourful shells from the Pacific, precious stones from the highlands, and even rare tropical fruits from distant valleys. This wide network of trade stitched the region together, binding far-flung communities into a peaceful web of mutual benefit. And in the centre of it all, Corral thrived as a cultural and economic hub. Religious and ceremonial life played a vital role in maintaining social harmony. The city's grand public spaces and sunken plazas likely served as stages for rituals that united the people under shared spiritual beliefs. Music filled these gatherings, flutes carved from condor bones, drums made from deer hides, creating soundscapes that echoed across the desert, tying individual lives to something greater. Leadership, too, appeared to rely less on military strength and more on spiritual authority and civic organization. The city's leaders must have coordinated massive construction projects, seasonal agricultural cycles, and complex trade agreements, all without leaving behind the brutal scars of war. In an ancient world so often defined by conflict, Corral stands as a shining exception, a reminder that civilization does not have to rise on the broken backs of the conquered. It can instead be built by the quiet power of collaboration, creativity, and trust. At Corral, the stones still seem to hum with echoes of a world long gone. It was not just a city of buildings and trade. It was a city alive with sound, ceremony, and spiritual rhythm. Music and ritual were woven into the very heartbeat of Corral's civilization. Archaeologists, digging carefully through the dry sands, uncovered a treasure trove of ancient instruments, flutes crafted from the bones of condors and pelicans, whistles fashioned from deer antlers, small drums stretched with animal hides. These artifacts were not simple toys. They were crafted with care, tuned to specific notes, designed to carry sound across the wide open plazas of the city. In a world without written language, music spoke the language of the soul. Imagine it, the low thrum of drums rising at dusk, flutes keening like the desert wind, feet stamping on the sunken plazas as hundreds gathered under the fading light. Fires would crackle atop the pyramid platforms. Priests, dressed in intricate woven garments, would chant to the gods of the river, the earth, the stars. In those moments, Corral was not just a city, it was a symphony. The layout of Corral itself suggests that ritual life was at its core. The grand plazas were not mere open spaces. They were stages for communal ceremonies, carefully designed to draw people together. The sunken circular courts acted like ancient amphitheatres, focusing sound and sight onto the rituals performed at their centres. And above them all, the pyramids loomed. Not as tombs, but as sacred mountains built by human hands, linking the earth to the heavens. Rituals likely marked the turning of the seasons, the cycles of planting and harvest, the movements of the stars. Music was not just entertainment. It was a bridge between people, between nature and the divine, between the known and the mysteries beyond. No violent murals, no terrifying gods of war, no bloodthirsty sacrifices. In Corral, the spiritual world seems to have been one of harmony, celebration, and reverence. Even today, when the desert wind whistles through the ruins, you can almost hear it. The faint strains of ancient music, the forgotten songs of a people who found beauty, meaning and connection in the heart of the harsh, endless sands. Carroll wasn't just a place of music, trade and ritual. It was a marvel of engineering, a testament to human ingenuity in one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. Without metal tools, without the wheel, without draft animals, the people of Carroll shaped a city of stone and earth that has endured nearly 5,000 years. Their achievements were astonishing. Massive pyramids rose from the desert floor, constructed not with small, fragile bricks, but with enormous stones carried across the dry valley. Workers transported rocks using reed bags, ingenious baskets strong enough to bear heavy loads, woven from the very plants that grew along the riverbanks. Layer upon layer, they built with care, stacking stone and filling the interiors with rubble to create structures that could withstand not only time, but nature's fury. And they understood nature well. Carroll lies in a region prone to violent earthquakes, yet their pyramids and plazas survived largely intact. How? By mastering earthquake-resistant architecture. Builders used flexible construction techniques, layered fills, wide foundations, and rounded corners that allowed their monuments to absorb and dissipate seismic energy. It was engineering born not from textbooks, but from an intimate knowledge of the earth itself. Water management was another silent triumph. Despite living in a desert, the people of Carroll developed sophisticated irrigation systems. Channels and canals carefully guided river water to their agricultural fields, allowing crops to flourish even during dry seasons. No water was wasted. Every drop mattered. The layout of Carroll itself reflected brilliant urban planning. Major structures aligned with key astronomical points, suggesting a deep understanding of the solar cycles. The sunken plazas, with their precise geometry, were more than gathering places. They were instruments for tracking the heavens, allowing priests and astronomers to predict seasons crucial for survival. Even the city's organization spoke of a complex society. Residential zones, administrative areas, ceremonial centers, all were arranged in harmony, balancing communal life with sacred spaces. They built not just for the moment, but for generations. Today, as modern engineers marvel at Carroll's resilience, they are reminded that greatness is not measured by technology alone. Sometimes the deepest wisdom lies in understanding the forces of nature, in working with the land, not against it. Carroll's stones have endured storms, quakes, and the erosion of time itself. They stand as a silent testament to a civilization that engineered their dreams into the desert sands. For centuries, the city of Carroll flourished, a beacon of peace, music, trade, and architectural mastery in the desert sands. And then, quietly, almost without a trace, it was abandoned. No fires marked its fall, no signs of conquest scar its walls, no mass graves or shattered monuments tell a story of sudden disaster. Instead, Carroll simply faded, its plazas emptied, its pyramids left to the drifting sands, its flutes and drums silenced by time. Why did they leave? That question still lingers like a ghost across the Super Valley. Some scholars believe that environmental change struck the final blow. Evidence suggests that a long period of drought may have crippled Carroll's agriculture. Without the river's life-giving waters, the fields would have withered. Trade networks, dependent on surplus cotton and food, would have faltered. The careful balance Carroll had maintained with its harsh environment may have finally tipped beyond repair. Other theories point to shifting trade routes. As neighbouring cultures grew and new centres of power emerged along the coast and inland, Carroll's influence might have diminished. Perhaps the goods they once supplied, cotton, fish, produce, were no longer enough to sustain their role as a dominant city. Slowly, the lifeblood of commerce drained away. Still others whisper of internal decline. Without written records, we can only imagine political struggles, religious upheaval, or simple exhaustion after centuries of growth. Even peaceful societies can fracture under pressure when survival becomes uncertain. Whatever the cause, the departure seems to have been gradual, not sudden. Families likely drifted away one by one, seeking more fertile valleys, stronger rivers, new beginnings. Children who once ran across Corral's plazas grew up telling stories of a lost city behind them, stories that would eventually fade into legend. The desert reclaimed what humans had built. Winds carried fine sand over stone temples. Flutes lay buried beneath shifting dunes. What had once been a humming, vibrant civilization became a field of silent, sleeping mounds. For nearly 4,000 years, Corral remained hidden, a whisper beneath the sands, waiting. Today, as archaeologists carefully uncover its stones, the question still burns. How does a city so advanced, so beautifully crafted, simply vanish? Perhaps the truth is that even the greatest civilizations, no matter how wise or peaceful, are still fragile, threads woven into the tapestry of time, forever vulnerable to the unseen forces of change. For millennia, Corral lay forgotten, buried beneath the silent sands of the Super Valley. Travellers passed the strange, rounded hills that dotted the landscape, never suspecting that beneath their feet lay the ruins of a civilization older than the pyramids of Egypt. To them, these were just natural formations, mounds shaped by the wind and time. It wasn't until the late 20th century that the world would finally hear Corral's voice again. In the 1990s, Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady led a team into the Soup Valley, driven by curiosity and a growing sense that these hills might hold secrets no one had yet uncovered. What they found would rewrite the story of human civilization in the Americas. Layer by painstaking layer, the sand was brushed away. Beneath it emerged walls of carefully cut stone, grand staircases, sunken plazas, pyramids, a city far older than anyone could have imagined. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the unbelievable. Corral was over 4,600 years old, thriving at the same time as the earliest civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt. It was a discovery that shook the foundations of archaeology. Before Corral, scholars believed that civilization in the Americas developed much later, shadowed by the great empires of the Old World. Corral changed everything. It proved that the Americas had birthed monumental architecture, complex urban life, and social organization independently, long before the rise of the Incas or the Maya. Ruth Shady and her team found not just stone and rubble, but the remnants of life: musical instruments, fishing nets, textiles, quipu, ancient knot records, and even offerings made to the gods. Each artifact told a story of a people who had built a society with vision, intelligence, and profound creativity. Corral's rediscovery was more than an academic triumph. It was a resurrection. A civilization that had slept beneath the desert for thousands of years now stood revealed under the open sky once more. Its plazas kissed by the same winds that had once carried the sounds of flutes and the laughter of children. Today, Corral is recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a fragile, priceless link to humanity's earliest dreams of building, belonging, and believing. The sands had hidden Corral well, but in the end, the stones endured, waiting for someone to listen, to see, to remember. Corral stands today as a silent giant, a reminder that civilization's roots stretch far deeper than we once believed. Among its pyramids and plazas, the ancient stones whisper a story that reshapes our understanding of humanity's journey, a story not of conquest and bloodshed, but of harmony, ingenuity, and hope. Long before the towering empires of Greece, Rome, or even Egypt, the people of Corral were building something extraordinary. They raised pyramids without the wheel. They mapped the stars without written records. They created a thriving society rooted in trade, music, ritual, and engineering, all without leaving scars of war upon the land. In an era often defined by conflict, Corral offers another vision of what civilization can be, a society that valued connection over conquest, knowledge over domination. It reminds us that complexity does not require violence, that greatness is not measured by how many armies march across a battlefield, but by how a community comes together to build, to create, to dream. Carroll's legacy reaches far beyond the dry sands of the Soup Valley. It challenges old assumptions that civilization had a single cradle, that urban life and monumental architecture belonged first to the Old World. Corral proves that humanity's spirit of innovation and aspiration arose independently in many corners of the earth, shaped by different hands, but driven by the same eternal desires: to endure, to celebrate, to reach toward the divine. Today, walking among Corral's weathered ruins, you can almost hear it. The pulse of drums, the low hum of flutes, the murmur of traders bargaining in the plazas, the laughter of children racing through stone alleys under a sky of endless stars. Their lives, their dreams, their stories are still with us, etched into the bones of the earth. Corral teaches us that even when civilizations fall, their spirit can endure, sleeping under sands, waiting to be remembered, waiting to inspire again. In the great timeline of human history, Corral shines not just as a relic of the past, but as a beacon for the future. A reminder that, even in the harshest deserts, even under the heaviest sands, the seeds of wonder, wisdom, and peace can take root, and build a world that reaches for the stars.